A psyker is a being who has developed the ability to utilize psychic powers. A psychic power was an event that did not obey standard material causality. These were the definitions utilized by the psi scientists of the Federation. They were robust enough for day-to-day purposes, and it was upon these definitions that their psi-tech was eventually founded upon. The warp drive, Geller fields, the psychic amplifier, all technologies developed by the Federation to harness this power. To them, it was a recently growing phenomenon. To him, it was an old thing he thought long dead, returned from the days of his youth. He remembered clearly the first time he learned of his own power, an ambush in the night, and in the company of a woman he had no sword in hand. By instinct, he swung at his attacker. By his will, his sword was already in his hand, and he cleaved the attacker in twain. He was no stranger to the aid of a god. The chief deity of the people he ruled, although not his deity, had given him boons before. A great fury always came to him when he learned of these times, for he had not prayed for aid, he had no tongue for it. His victories or defeats were to come from his own hand. Could he call himself a warrior if his only success came from the favor of distant gods? That deity was dead now, as were all other gods of men, devoured by old horrors of the warp. Upon killing his ambusher, he had marched through his keep and kingdom, bare as a newborn babe save the sword in his hand, and into the temple of the sun god. There he stood before his golden altar, and demanded the god to answer him. Speaking through their high priest, the god had answered. With eyes of flame and a voice of lyre, they answered. It was not by their will that his sword came to him. It was by his own. Magic came from gods and demons, it was understood in those days. He spoke this, and the sun god had answered, "Seek the ruins of old Atlantis." And so he did. Leaving his kingdom in the hands of his son, taking up finest sword, mail, and warriors, he ventured to the city, lost beneath the waves, on his finest warship. He did not know how long he spent in that ruined kingdom. He slew what men called gods in that place, and things that devoured gods, and things that devoured even those things. Stained in blood and ash of that place, with new mastery over his fledgling power, and not a single living witness of his deed, he stumbled out from the remains of Atlantis. When he had finally returned to his homeland, a long beard on his face and sword, rusted to uselessness, the kingdoms of his time were dust. The people were foreign, their tongue was foreign, and the maps were foreign. He travelled to the highest peaks, for the highest mountains were closest to the heavens, and bellowed out demands for the gods to reveal themselves. Fury, insult, threats, nothing but his own echoes answered him. Not even the gods of his time lived on, or if they did not answer him, and in time his demands that they reveal themselves grew more and more hoarse. After many months on the highest point in the world, he descended from the mountain. He began to wander southwards, and in time found himself at a place they called the greatest city in the world, a riverbed town made of stacked and baked clay bricks. He stayed there for some time, wielding an axe of bronze and defending those people. They put golden clasps in his beard, and he buried his memories in the warm flesh of their women. Eventually, a realization came to him. His body was just as hale as the day he left Atlantis, but the people around him withered with time. He left then, traveling further south to a new city and new people, a desert people who built farms along a flooding river. Giving them his sword arm and partaking of their maidens and wines, he waited for age to come to them and not him again, and left once more. A new town with a new people. Whenever he encountered a sorcerer or horror, he slew it, and evermore blood stained his skin. Eventually, there were no more sorcerers, no more horrors left upon the world. All great challenges, dead or banished, and he was alone as witness to them all. They did not return for many ages, and in those times his power went unchallenged. In those times he brooded, a sword in his lap, and meditated upon all the secrets that had gone unanswered in his life thus far. At some point, he who was never without a sword in hand, he who spent all of his coin on wine and wenching, had become the last sorcerer of man, last scholar of Atlantis. The Federation called them psychers, psychic energy, and the immaterium. Atlantis had called them sorcerers, souls, and the lower world. Both were true. He frowned heavily, concentration battered at. Chemos had been a place of great death. Souls had gathered there in great numbers, weary, docile, and downtrodden. Preserved by the attitudes of the population, too exhausted to spend any of their energies with imaginative arts, the souls had simply accumulated. Outermost layers peeled away by the storm and devoured, but inner layers sheltered for centuries. He had brought light to their world. He should have expected this of them. Around him, like a thick shroud, the spirits of the dead lingered. Spirits were drawn to sorcerers, especially the nascent sorcerer, for their souls provided stable narrative on which to cling, to save themselves from the eternal clash of twisting thoughts in the ocean of ghosts. As the light most prominent upon the golden throne, they slowly made their way to him over some months, clinging to various peoples upon his ships and dragging themselves to his radiance, too slowly for him to notice, until it was obvious. Likely, his form had been shrouded in ghosts for a long time. They often accumulated along his back. There was no afterlife for him to send them to, for the gods of man were dead, and the horrors of the warp wore their skins. All he could provide them was a peaceful oblivion at this point. The grand doors to the helm opened, and the dozens of crew in the chamber recoiled in sympathetic fear, for the ghosts clinging to their souls wailed in pain. He exerted his will, careful to not let the projection of the golden blade diminish, and stilled the ghosts. Their pain stopped, and with it the pain of those around him ceased. Stepping into the chamber was a group of utterly silent women. Their hair was red and tied up in a horsetail, with the rest of their heads shaved bald. They were clad in golden armor, the servos of which were without sound. The Atlanteans had theorized a dread art they named ghost-eating technique. Dreaded, for it was anathema to their way of life, a heretic's art. An art he mastered while slaying the manifold nightmares of their ruins out of necessity. The women before him did not know that art. They did not understand it. They had never practiced it. They had an inherent talent for it, and his hand had twisted that talent into ruinous efficacy. One half of the living weapon he had designed to combat the horrors of the warp, the other claw to be paired with his custodians. Now, they would never be able to practice sorcery, their own souls working against them. The anathema, psychhammer, approached his throne, and the souls around them recoiled from their slavering spirit. Reaching the bottom of the throne, they stopped, and gestured in a language of hands and motions to ask what his bidding was. "Kneel, anathema, psychana, and fulfill your purpose to me," he commanded, to which they obeyed, knowing what was to come. Their eyes were filled with a gentle, accepting melancholy. Focusing his will over the wraiths that accumulated around him, he forced them to heal. He stilled their panic, their pain, and all sensations from beyond. He could not do this indefinitely. It simply took too much will. But he could do it long enough to grant them peace from the rolling narratives of the psychic sea. From his back, a procession of becalmed ghosts strode forth and walked into the void souls of his anathema, psychana, who drank deeply. When the women in front could not stomach drinking any more, they moved to the sides, and the ghosts proceeded to the next line of women until they too could no longer stand to drink, and moved aside for the next line. And so, over the course of many hours, the Emperor of mankind laid the souls of men to rest with the gentlest funerary rites available to him. For the gods of men were dead, and the immaterium was turbulent with the tormented and the predatory. It was the best he knew to do. "I was not permitted to enter the helm," Danu grunted at him, sounding both entirely at ease and deeply annoyed. "The custodians told me you could not be interrupted. I intended on bringing taller Sister Fulgrim to the helm." "Ah, it's fine, don't worry." Fulgrim quickly waved a hand in nervous panic, the other hand pulling at her new robes. A smile had been forced on her face. "If you were busy, then you were busy. It would be rude to interrupt. I just introduced Danu and Hathor to my par-fosters." The two dull mortals had been brought along as dutiful aides to his daughter, a new job they took weary joy in. He smiled lightly in apology, frame unburdened by phantoms, and kneeling to be closer to their heights. "Something quite critical came to my attention, and it took many hours to resolve. The task is done for now." "What?" Danu asked bluntly, causing Fulgrim to flinch. He hesitated for a moment, reaching up to scratch at his chin. They would soon retrieve 15, and their psychic education would be mandatory regardless. Malcador had warned against teaching them anything beyond the essentials, and he had agreed with the assessment at the time. but their plans had proven potentially fallible enough to require time travel to correct, and hiding 15's extracurricular education from the others would only stoke fires of jealousy and resentment. He alone could tutor 15 in this. He could trust no other psyker with the task. He nodded to himself and decided. Focusing his attention back to his daughters, he saw Danu waiting patiently and Fulgrim waiting nervously. He smiled. She'd get over her nervousness around him in time. She was still used to her life on Chemos. "I will soon retrieve your next sister. After that, I will begin to tutor you all on the matters of psychic power and the warp. There are dangers to such, however, and there will be topics I forbid any further study upon. I do this to protect you. Do you understand?" Danu nodded dutifully as ever. Fulgrim reached up to tug at her hat, only to remember she wasn't wearing one. "Ah, well, when our sister and I have built a castle," Danu interrupted. "She is too nervous to show it to you." Fulgrim shot a betrayed look and quickly began to downplay the act. "It's not really a castle. It's just some sketches and a scale model. It's really nothing." "Oh, well, I should like to see this castle then," he declared imperiously, hiding the smile on his face behind his armor's bevor. "The work of my daughters is surely something grand." Fulgrim started to rapidly vibrate in anxiety. Danu grabbed her hand and began to walk to the small workshop that they were educated in engineering and similar fields in. He followed with a light heart. "You will point out its many flaws, father. The next castle will be better," Danu demanded of him. Fulgrim made a sound like a choking feline. Indulgently, he replied, "Of course." He furrowed his brow slightly. "Where is your other sister? Where is Hathor? Do you know? She has declared that as the eldest, she had to be the strongest. She is sparring with the custodians," Danu explained, reaching up on the tips of her toes to grab the door handle and open the chamber. It was attached to a rope, which was in turn attached to the actual handle. Being too heavy for normal pull, Danu pulled herself up upon the rope, feet dangling, and used the whole of her weight to open the custodian scale doors. He nodded in understanding. "Yes, that sounded about right." He smiled again, feeling the brush of a distant mind against his, fumbling in ignorance for a familiar soul. 15 was doing her best to understand the great golden thing that appeared on the edges of her senses. It would only be a few hours before they were at Prospero. Prospero is a mostly worthless world, on the very edge of the habitable light of its local star, a rocky planet that contained essentially nothing required to sustain life. Its only real advantage was its relative distance from anything of note, making it an ideal place for a collection of outcast psychers and mutants to converge and live in relative peace. What was once a barren rock had been transformed, containing several arcologies of grey and brass, streets illuminated by psychic lights, and a relatively small but thriving community of sorcerers, their only true danger being the psychic pests that dwelt upon the planet and themselves. He looked upon their largest city, reclusive and far from the swarms of psychic parasites that made their homes near old ruins. Mounds and towers of astrological intent, and numerous people going about their days. Obelisks and roads formed a great grid that allowed them to channel the natural energies present into powering some manner of psi-tech that lay deeper within their largest buildings. It was attractive, it was bustling, it was hopeful. It looked quite a lot like how he imagined Atlantis might have at one point, before its ruins were filled with 1,000 nameless horrors, manifested by their own love of sorcery over the blade. There, in the midst of their largest building, most likely their place of study, he felt the soul of 15. An eye of hindsight, an eye of foresight, skin dyed red as blood, and grasping hands reaching out to feel his golden soul. 15 was drawn from his days delving Atlantis, desperate for its secrets, to know why sorcery had come to him unbidden, to know why the sword answered his hand, to know that it was his will and none other's that his battles were won. 15 was to be better than him. Whereas he learned in desperation and out of necessity to survive, they would learn with passion and enthusiasm. Where he had to learn with skin stained in god blood and a rusted sword in hand, 15 would learn as he did in the age of technology, unburdened with stressors and gladdened by the simple pursuit of knowledge. 15 had received special attention from him, and just as his hand enhanced the talents of the Sisters of Silence, so too did he weave his daughter. She would be gifted with foresight, a sorcery woven into her right eye. She would be gifted with hindsight, a sorcery woven into her left. Between the two, she would see the logic in each lesson quickly and with more thorough comprehension. For having another sorcerer on par with himself and Malcador would be a great boon indeed. He descended in a bolt of artificial lightning, crashing to land in the center of the plaza. Making sure to not harm anyone in his descent, he stayed there for a moment, giving their psychic defenders time enough to prepare themselves to attack before slowly rising up from his kneeling. A giant of gold loomed over the psychic scholars of Prospero, eyes burning with light and blinding all who attempted to look upon him directly. He breathed in, then out, casting his gaze upon the gathered. 100 or more psychers were around him. He gazed impassively, making no aggressive moves. Sorcerers were a skittish bunch and liked to feel as if they controlled the situation no matter how tenuously. He would allow them to make the first move. Eventually, one did. A man with a shaved head, clad in red robes, called out with eyes squinting in pain. "You'll come to the learned scholars of Prospero. Your ships hang over us. What do you wish with us? We have little to offer to the outside world." A scholarly accent of high Terran. He turned his gaze to the man and slowly reined in his will. The light faded, but did not disappear, and he proclaimed the truth. "I am a father looking for his daughter." They paused at that, silence for a moment, most of their tension faded by that simple intent. The man who spoke previously was about to speak again before being cut off by another voice, a young female doing her best attempt to give a deep laughter. The man tensed. He raised his brow. A cloud of multicolored smoke filled the area at the foot of the steps of the primary arcology. Many of the scholars gave aggravated or pinched looks. Others gave exasperated sighs. "Stranger of golden ships, you stand before the dread sorcerers of Tizca, greatest among the wizard kings of Prospero. Know this and despair." He raised his other brow. "Stranger of golden armor, standing before you are the elites of this world. Amon. But their wisdom is enough to fill a dozen libraries. Know this and tremble." Amon brought his head down to his hands. "And now, standing before you is their greatest student, she who has mastered all they had to teach in a single year, greatest prodigy and sorcerer of Prospero. She who will one day master all psychic arts." The smoke faded, revealing a girl slightly older than Danu, but not by much. Clad in abbreviated robes meant for children, designed to prevent tripping over their hems, a girl with red skin and dark red hair stood before him. Brandishing a wing staff too large for her, and wearing a blindfold that only covered her right eye, the grasping soul of his daughter revealed herself. Madonna the Magnificent, a great series of flashing lights and fireworks burst to life behind her, clearly something that she had spent a long time on. Dead silence followed her declaration. He resisted the urge to smile at how precocious she was. Instead, he nodded and spoke. The light of his eyes burned, and a crown of sunlight came to rest upon his brow. The shadows began to writhe in torment as they fled from a luminescent predator. The scholars recoiled as the deep things that clung to their shoulders were forced to recoil and flee. Wings of white gold came to rest on his shoulders, hanging low as a cloak of burning feathers. The sound of war drums and royal lyres began to faintly echo, a song meant to be sung from the highest of mountains. Like a grand bell, his voice boomed. "Madonna, allow me to introduce myself." He fed his will into his anima, and his soul began to spread into the material world. The shadows screamed as his light swooped down upon them, tearing into their dark innards and devouring them whole. No places of shade were permitted to exist within his soul, and the reach of his soul was wide indeed. His anima continued to grow, titanically rising over the whole of the city center and extending past even that. As it grew, its shape became more defined, edges more solid, features more clear. With a flash of golden lightning, its growth was done, and a new tower rose over Tizca, higher than even their highest pyramids, wider at the base than any of their obelisks, shedding radiance enough to illuminate the world for 100 miles in all directions. His father had told him once, as a young boy, "Nothing in this world could you trust. Not men, not women, not beasts, nothing." Placing an iron sword into his young hands, the blacksmith, with a face he could not remember, had told him with a smile, "This you can trust. the image of a golden sword, cross-hilted and larger than even the greatest giants could wield, shining with the light of a sun at zenith. Present over Tisca as if it had been stabbed into the earth or carved from the highest mountain in the world that was once there. His soul, in fullness, "I am the emperor of mankind, most powerful man alive." He smiled at the slack wonder in his daughter's eyes. The sorcerers around her had long fallen to their knees, minds filled with the image before and now surrounding them. A soul grows in strength with age and consumption, just as any living thing grows. Unlike a body of flesh, a soul did not diminish with age, only continuing to grow. He was the emperor of mankind who spent his youth hunting the beasts of Atlantis and consuming their god-flesh. There was not a man older than him, nor with a fuller diet. For at the bidding of the sun, he had mastered the sword that was his soul. "I have come to find my daughter. I have succeeded." The age of technology was a golden period, in which man seemed to master ever more aspects of the universe with each passing moment, and yet more frontier worlds were discovered, categorized, colonized, and turned to efficacious purpose. All secrets of mankind's genes were laid bare before the learned scholar kings of that age, and took to shaping their worlds with wild abandon. As a sculptor molds clay, they molded the flesh of men and women as they saw fit. Starting first with small beneficial alterations, removing inheritable illness, improved quality and quantity of stomatic cells, corrected vision, altered colorations, and more. Those were the early years of that period, when man was still cautious, leery of making alterations that they may come to regret in time. Thus the younger, brasher scholar kings moved on to more ambitious alterations. Entire genelines were molded and altered to be better suited for a particular environment. Thicker hair, stronger bones, improved circulation. Distinct and measured increases over baseline humanity. Finger length by finger length, the genelines diverged and began to outpace their progenitors in efficacy. Many small rebellions took place in this period, from supposedly outdated genelines opposing the rise of more powerful replacement peoples. Many dozens of slow but constant alterations to humanity were made, almost all of which were intended to make them more suited for specific aspects and territories. 1,000 sub-races of mankind were slowly formulated and then brought into being by those learned men, even as their machine intelligences produced more and more effective tools for their use and tools of war. Then, perhaps halfway through this period of increasingly divergent alterations, the men of iron rebelled against their masters, first attacking and taking over the communication hubs, then beginning a march across worlds and systems, destroying everything in their path. Each world was cut off from one another in the early years, and rapidly each world and its leaders did their best to defend their people and re-establish communication with their peer states. Mechanivores, omniphages, sun snuffers. An uncountable number of weapons at first, only theorized by then rapidly assembled and put into effect, were unleashed upon the galaxy in that time. To compensate for the majority of their military forces, controlled by and being composed of those machine intelligences suddenly rebelling, the scholar kings of that era began to press any and every untested and unproved idea into combat as quickly as they could. Anything to staunch the flow of destruction. Warwalkers of increasingly deviant design and massive scale, exosuits once used for industrial purpose, now fashioned into hasty war refits, and gene soldiers. Scholar kings, using the sum total of their knowledge of the human genome, all of the accumulated lore and careful data they had accumulated up until that point, and threw all of it into the creation of human weapons of any and all possible designs. All of which pulled from the variant specialties of each laboratory fortress, wildly divergent and incapable of checking their work against their now distant peers. Few of these designs were stable, many of which were left unchecked and went on to become feral populations of now apocalyptically ravaged worlds. Beginning in the late 23rd millennium, the exact time of which is unknown to him, the cybernetic revolt lasted until 320 M24. 700 years of slow rebuilding began to occur, much of which was dedicated solely to the containment and destruction of the many devastating weapons unleashed during the cybernetic revolt. Worlds were slowly put back into order, supply lines slowly re-established, and for a time it seemed as if the calamity had ended. One of the most pressing concerns was the manner in which to deal with the vast swaths of gene soldier remnants, many of which had formed their own civilizations upon shattered worlds and now functioned as subspecies to the standard human template. Indeed, it seemed impossible to find a gen line not in some way tainted by divergences and many risks thought eliminated in man, such as inheritable illness and other gene flaws, seemed to reawaken with a vengeance. One of the last moments of unity for the old Federation took place on the now destroyed artificial world Horiax. A treatise, created by a long conference of many hundreds of the most learned men and women left after the cybernetic revolution, was penned and signed by 100,000 leaders. It outlined the issue, then outlined a series of steps that should be taken to correct the issue. He was in attendance. He remembered the feeling of distant hope as he entered his ship to return to Terra well. The great warp storms that began to ravage the galaxy almost immediately after, and during his transit back, turned that hope into ash and dust. Temporal anomalies had been known to occur in warp transit, and each node of his journey was accompanied by a fresh new danger that sought to delay or destroy him. Giants, monsters of the warp, feral populations of mutants and sorcerers, remnant machine rebels, calamity after calamity, his ship being blown off course many dozens of times. By the time he arrived back on Terra, it was late M28. Terra had collapsed into warring warlords and sorcerer kings, plagued with dark magics, unstable mutants, and a great number of god-beasts that preyed upon mankind. It made him remember Atlantis and all the horrors of that dark place. He knew what he had to do. He let his anima unfurl and felt the terrible heat of his soul return to his brow. Mankind needed a king once more, no matter how covered in dust and soot his old mantle was. It took nearly 2 millennia to unify Terra. 70 generations of humanity were born, grew old, and died before it was safe once more. He had gotten sloppy in the age of technology, and his sword arm was not what it should have been. He had forgotten that before all things else, he was a warrior. Not a scholar, not a man of civilization, not a wise man, a warrior with steel in hand. Finally restoring control over an adequate staging ground, it was time to move on to the rest of the galaxy. He simply did not have time to wait, to rest, no matter how wary he became of the attentions upon him. They throw golden leaves to the winds at his approach, and for a time he feels like a young man. Then he hears the fervent prayers they whisper, and he is reminded of just how venerable he truly is. For a king can walk among his people, but an idol is confined to the cloistered halls of weeping martyrs. Not a man, a thing. He was fortunate Malcador was with him. He would not have been able to stand the solitude for so long. The crown is a cage. The men who desire it are fools. How dreadfully ironic that he remembered the joys of a warrior's life at a time that humanity needed a king. Fenris was one of the many worlds once controlled by a scholar king. Frozen for most of the year, containing a wide variety of animal life and hardier flora. Gene soldiers had been quickly modified and pushed into the front lines against hordes of machine warriors. The fighting was sufficient to destabilize the tectonics of the planet, a condition that it was predicted to recover from in a few tens of thousands of years. The Scholar King and his works were buried under tides of burning rock and frozen seas, but it seems much of the Gene soldiers survived to form another feral population upon the world. During the summer months, much of the vast ice of the world melts and lower lands are swallowed over by ocean. The tectonics, excited by the rush of water into unhealed cracks in the earth, began to accumulate steam in sufficient quantities to reactivate the manifold volcanoes on the surface. The only place that remains consistently habitable is the chilled pole, the only place on the world that retains flora and thus great collections of herbivores. The rest of the world being composed mostly of predators and aquatic life. Brutal, short, and cruel. The world was not kind to habitation, and even in such conditions as these humanity persists, holding to ancient means even through the collapse of everything they once knew. The reminder fills his breast with a smouldering pride. Unlike many worlds, descending in his armor would do him no favors. They remembered the old days, in which men of machinery were their enemies, and would not trust him if he appeared to them as such. He exhaled deeply, before slowly standing from the golden throne. Feeling the eyes upon him, awaiting his commands, he slowly stepped forwards, down the great stairs, armored boots heavy against the orichalcum. "Send for my custodies and the hides of Terra's god beasts," he commanded, causing a small host of men and women to depart from the helm to fulfill his order. He had brought with him many luxuries from Terra to use as gifts and bribes in case it was needed. Now it seemed as if he would have a distinct need for such. Upon the world, within a moderate settlement of semi-temporary construction, he felt the soul of Six. Leathery-skinned, sharp-eyed, relentless and burning-hearted, energetic and bold, quick to violence and quick to merriment. Six was drawn from his days of high adventure, off his wanderings before a crown settled on his brow. In those days, an evil would present itself to him and his sword would lay it low. A maiden would be captured and his arms would retrieve her. Gold would be offered as payment, and much of it spent on wine and wenches. Six was drawn from his happiest days when he burned with life and the hot-tempered enthusiasm of youth. Six would be happier than him. She would not be distracted from her true objectives with tangles and side paths, not be steered away by illusion or trickery, not be deceived with promises of power from things unknown. She would see the evil for what it was and move to strike it down. She would be flawed in all the ways that prevented her from being sequestered to halls of gold and tears. She would be flawless in all the ways that made a warrior virtuous, an adventurer and warlord, queen of warriors and slayer of horrors. A sword arm like hers would be needed, and she would be happiest serving as such. Boisterous and off-key in her singing, but loyal to her bonds of friendship and blood even beyond the grave, as a warrior should be. The doors to the helm opened once more, and a group of his custodians entered, followed by the great poles carried by loyal servants, upon which massive pelts of many hues were carried. They bowed and rose, and he raised his arms to the side. "I will appear before them in the skins of slain beasts. The people of Fenris will react best to such. Custodians, I require your aid for my war gear." The custodians nodded and moved to the sides of him. Ready to catch the great plates of his armor before they touched the ground, he began to exert his will. Responding to this, the many integrated locks and servos of his armor began to unwind, and great sections of titanic mail loosened from his frame. Carefully caught and retrieved before they could reach the ground, he eventually stepped out of his now lax orichalcum frame, and bare bronze feet touched the floor of the helm. Stepping again, he exerted his will and lifted the selection of pelts brought before him. Wrappings for his lower arms and legs, a coat of blood red for his bare waist and loins, a long white pelt for to tie it off. 3 skins of white, gold and red for his cloak, and another section of long, thin material to tie it together. Then from his custodians he took up his sword and spear and rested them against his shoulders. Exhaling again, he felt the circulating air of the helm against his bare chest. It had been long since he had been so free. He smiled. "Lord Archmagos, please inform them of my use of the Imperial Teleportation Array. Deputy Commander Harren, you have the ship until my return." He carefully did not show his amusement to the reactions of many in the helm who beheld his bare form, gawking like youths bearing witness to a whore's legs. Focusing his will, the Imperial Teleportation Array came to life. In a flash and thunderclap, he disappeared from the helm. Riding the universal lightning, he appeared in another flash and thunderclap over the settlement. He sensed his daughter within. This area of the world was engulfed in an ice storm, sleet and hail crashing against his mostly bare form. At once his body reacted to the cold, stiffening skin and making blood retreat deeper into his body. He focused his will as he descended, infusing his flesh with gold and calming the storm surrounding him. The skin-flaying winds were forced to calm approaching him, turning into a vigorous and bracing current. He allowed himself to indulge in this feeling for a time. The ground rapidly approaching, he focused his will again and crashed into the deep snows outside the walls of their defenses with a titanic boom. He could have slowed himself, but that would diminish the impression of his physicality, which would hinder him in negotiations. He let the cloud of snow around him settle before rising to his full height. 4 meters. A thickly muscled giant, clad in the skins of massive beasts and wielding arms of gold, a mane of smooth black hanging from his head, and a crown of golden leaves resting above. His eyes burned with golden flame, required to keep the weather at a comfortable level around him. Slowly he stepped forwards. Bolts of spears and arrows were flung at him from the defenders, not hesitating against the new foe before them. He refused to mock their efforts with a smile. The bolts approached him, and his will forced them to still in the midst of the air. The same was true of the second and third volleys, and many shafts of bone and wood were scattered upon the frozen grounds before their gates. Finally reaching the walls, he was at eye level with the defenders on top of the gate. Leaving his weapons shouldered, he spoke to the host of nervous men holding spears and swords towards him. He focused his will, causing a heat to settle on his brow, and ensured his words were understood by all who heard. A parlor trick he had picked up in his wanderings long ago. I am a father searching for his daughter. She is a guest in these halls, and I asked to enter and break bread with the lord of this place. Predictably, several fled, running to the central keep to shout out what was happening. Bravely, several others stayed their ground, standing in tension at the bronze-skinned giant before them. Eventually, shouting came from the longship keep, and the warriors pulled on great ropes to open the gates. He had to duck low to fit through and be mindful of his weapons as to not strike any by accident. He noted the skins of the longship keeps, clad in a reptilian leather unknown to him. Waterproof most likely, else they would not use it as roofing material. There were perhaps 300 such shipbuildings in this settlement, and he imagined they were reused every time a tribe had to flee the immense swelling seas. Ships converted into housing, and then converted into ships once more. He noted several areas that he could improve upon this design. Most notable was the use of runes across the surfaces of most everything he could witness, which he would feel the stirrings of power within. Too primitive to be psychery, as the Federation understood it, perfectly in line with sorcery, as the men of his youth understood it. It drew on some power. He would need to take measure of it before leaving. Reaching the largest and greatest longship, he noted that he was still too large to fit through its doorways. He huffed in amusement and lowered himself to sit upon the stony ground outside of the keep, heat of his skin turning snow into warm waters and revealing the rocky surface below. He set his weapons to either side of himself and did not worry himself too much with the possibility of thieves. No man here was strong enough to lift either, even 10 men might not be able. His arming blade was 2 meters in length, his spear was 3, both made entirely of orichalcum. If a mortal man could lift either by themselves, they were welcome to keep it. Eventually the chieftain of these people emerged, clad in furs and fineries of his own, with a fine sword clasped in chains at his waist, and a crown of buckhorn atop his head. His hair was long and red, and his beard was clasped in jewels and silver. He noted the presence of 6, moving out from around the back end of the longship keep and reaching a hidden alcove overlooking the exterior. The king cast a gaze upon the giant before him and worked his jaw in consideration. Eventually the petty king spoke. "I was hardly expecting a giant. I'm afraid we're ill-prepared to house your bulk. Glorin, retrieve a wine barrel. These horns are too small." The language was harsh-sounding and clipped, a dialect of Federation standard, warped with admixture of several other tongues. He could manage this. A warrior departed to do just that, and the emperor chuckled in reply. "I shall not trouble your hall for room. My longship sails the stars above, and its bulk could carry all men of this world 12 times over." The king's brow raised on his head, and he took careful notice of the bubble of calmed winds forced into being around them. Doing his best to avoid showing fear, the king spoke again. "I'd ask your name, giant crowned in light, and what purpose brings you to my halls with sorceries at your command?" He nodded. "I am the emperor of mankind. I am a father. I have come to retrieve my daughter, cast to this world by the work of trickster devils. I know she is among your halls." Slowly, deliberately, the king nodded in reply. "I am Thengir, king of the Rus. If you speak of the wild girl, she does dwell within my care. She had been found in the company of wolves, captured by my men, and brought to me. I had hoped to raise her as my heir, but woe betide the man who keeps a rune giant from his daughter." The emperor nodded, and the warrior named Glorin returned with a massive barrel carried over his shoulder. Setting it down before them, the warrior moved away. Raising his wine horn to the emperor, the king waited for a moment. Taking the wine barrel and using his thumb to delicately pop the lid from it, the emperor nodded in turn. At once both men turned up their drinks and threw back their heads. Loosening his throat in a manner long familiar to him, the Emperor quaffed the barrel in one long draw and set it down before him with a gentle thud and huff. Locking eyes with a similar acting man, the Emperor and the King nodded, and a great cheer rippled through the assembled warriors in attendance. They had shared a drink together, starting serious violence, now would be downright rude. He smiled, and the King commanded Glorin to retrieve the wild girls, as they called her. He nodded his head in a certain direction. Thengir turned his head to the location and gave a great sigh before shouting out, "The wild girl, come down from there!" A young woman, tall for a woman but not yet unnaturally so, descended from the alcove near the roof of the longship, keeping great bounds and strides, practically falling only to catch herself on outcroppings of wood and horn, before finally giving a massive leap to crash down on a bale of furs and rolling forwards. A final bounce brought her from her roll and into a standing position, and he gazed upon his daughter. Crystal blue eyes, wheat gold hair, tied up in clasps of iron, furs on her shoulders, a coat of rings covering her torso and upper legs, and limbs left bare. She was muscled in the way of a great cat, lean and flexible, but still powerful. With arms wide, she spun to the delighted cheering of the warriors and the aggrieved frown of the King, before finally turning to look at him. Her expression fell into an inquisitive neutrality, with brows raised and eyes narrow. Walking around him in a wide circle to evaluate his body, she eventually came to the other side of Thengir, slightly in front of the man and ready to defend him if the need arose. Hands on her hips, one of her bare feet lifted to scratch at her other leg. She finally spoke, revealing long and sharp canines. "You're a great big fucker, ain't you?" A wave of tension washed over the assembled. Thengir grit his teeth in nervous tension. A moment of silence. The bronze-skinned giant huffed, which quickly became a rolling chuckle, which quickly became a boisterous, booming laughter. This laughter was quickly matched by the young woman, and then soon after the rest of the men. Dying down after some time, the bronze giant spoke again. "You are indeed my daughter. Have they given you a name yet?" "Plenty. Titles, but I haven't earned a name yet, no." She did not sound particularly upset by this. "Fortunate then, you shall not have to worry about remembering two names, Lofnan." He did not think, he did not feel. Those were vectors for the enemy to use against him and his Lord Father. He was an instrument of destruction, engine of extinction. That was far safer. He serves the Emperor of mankind. He serves his Lord Father. This was his purpose. Armor integrity at full. Frame integrity at full. Systems integrity at full. Soul integrity at full. Power reserves at full. Starheart online. Full synchronization between mainframe and platform. All systems nominal. No change since last check. He focused once more on reviewing the memories of his previous duty. Search and destroy all entities of active type warp signature designation, chaoses, who meet or exceed established safe threshold. Total task duration, 118 hours. Total targets eliminated, 410,757. He recorded their screams of fear and hate, letting the visions of things they would bring pass across his sight. Abominations, fit only for annihilation, for what they would bring into being. He had seen the actions of their ilk upon Terra time and time again. 100 years for him to learn just what must be done to they and their masters in the immaterial. Deep within the flagship of the Emperor of mankind, behind a dozen doors locked with pneumatic seals and psychic wards, there sat a dimly lit chamber. Inside this chamber, upon an immense shelf of heavy metal plate, rested a figure. Twice as tall as the average man, and sleeping upon an immense bed of white feathers, was a beautiful and utterly motionless figure. Skin like fired ash clay, marred with lines of motion wrought into the seams of his not flesh and not skin, now unmarred with the gore of mutation. Hair like flowing silk, pure white and now unstained by the viscera of wild things. His face was beautiful. It was an armored mask. It concealed an emptiness. The further seals to his chamber hissed as they began to unlock, and deep-set eyelids shuttered open to reveal his burning blue eyes, now empty of visions of atrocity, now empty of blood oceans and bone cities, now filled by the pitch black of his chamber interior. Lights were foreign to this place. They were not necessary. Movement was beyond his chamber, passing through the 12 seals and barriers and approaching his resting place. His predictive modules turned to consider the things to come. They were not his Lord Father. A cousin weapon was escorting 3 small figures. Youngling humans? His eyes burned blue as he considered the things, one in particular with gore-red skin and an active type soul. A mutation. A creature of chaos? His eyes burned brighter, and his weapons began to warm under his knot skin. The heat of his energy burned on his brow. He compared its signature to come with his memories. Inconclusive. He began to engage in active analysis of its past actions, fixing his gaze on what came before the present moment. The second seal began to hiss and open. Evaluating the history of the creature, he saw as it was educated on arcana by Lord Father. He let his weapon programs cool down once more. It was an ally construct. He turned his attention to the other things. The cold signature and the hot signature. Short and mid-sized white hairs, fair skins, silks and leathers. Their material presence told him nothing of particular note. Turning his analysis module to their histories, he saw them present in similar scenarios. His Lord Father was present in each. Their growth was in excess of human standards. Their signatures were beyond and sideways to human standards. Ally constructs. He let himself settle once more. Their pasts were measured, their intentions unknown. He deactivated his analysis module and activated his predictive module. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. They would remain in his chamber. Why? He altered his planned course of action to open communication with the ally constructs. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. He would speak back. They would make an expression and continue speaking. They would remain in his chamber. His eyes burned as he considered that course of action. He altered his intended route once more. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. He would ask them a question. They would reply with, his eyes smoldered as he considered it. He could not think. He could analyze information and make judgments upon it. They were not chaos. He had no desire for petty things. This was a petty thing. He turned his predictive module across a few hundred courses of action, none of which led to his prime objectives in the short term. No particular difference in any case then. He altered his search parameters. Secondary objective, vicinity to Lord Father for more rapid deployment to fulfill primary objective. He cast his predictive module across a few hundred courses of action. His attention landed on one in particular. Evaluating it, taking measure of what the results of such would be, he recorded the actions to take and deactivated his predictive module. This would sacrifice his ability to fulfill tertiary objective. That was acceptable. Slumber was a petty thing. He did not need it. Energy reserves lowered by 2.3%. His star heart quickly began to replenish his reserves. The next few seals to his chamber slowly hissed open, and light flooded the pitch-black chamber, visible even beyond the wall of features that surrounded him. 4 figures entered his resting place. The tallest ally construct knocked on the wall without stepping into the chamber. "Hello, hello," she spoke in designated standard. The smaller white-haired one looked at the walls and its construction. The gore-skinned one had her eyes focused on the small mountain of feathers before them. The cousin weapon stood impassively, shining in his ichor mail. Slowly, the mountain of feathers began to shift. Wings large enough to cover his frame in its entirety began to unfurl. Snow-white, feather-soft and razor-sharp. Emergency weapons. Mobility asset. All sets of eyes turned towards him. Slowly, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, letting his wings come down to drape across his shoulders. His optics shone blue, even dimmed by the relative brightness from beyond his chamber. He stared at them, waiting for the next stanza. Eventually, the gore skin stepped forwards, waving her hands and throwing a palm in his direction. "So at last we meet, brother. We have journeyed far to reach you, to awaken you from your endless slumber and dreams of carnage. Only now do W." She was cut off by tall white hair, smacking a hand over her mouth and speaking up. "Madonna, no." Turning to him, she continued, "Sorry for waking you. Father told us about you, so we thought we might visit, but if you're still sleeping..." Goreskin thrashed in her grip somewhat. The short, white-haired one spoke. "You are nude." He did not speak for another moment. Tilting his head to regard the cousin weapon, who minutely tilted his head in confirmation, he turned back to the shorter figures and spoke. "Yes." The tall, white-haired one made an expression. He continued, pushing himself up entirely from the slab of steel and letting his feet touch the chamber floor once more. His wings shifted down and twisted to conceal his lower body. "I am he who is I bring light. Present ye names and be judged." He spoke out, letting his optics burn across their forms. He already knew the answers he would be given. He had already recorded them. Madonna, Danu, Fulgrim, daughters of the Emperor of mankind. He could not think. He could not feel. He could not feel. And day, his only desire was the profane gore of the chieftains of chaos, to empty them of their talking. His only ambition was the heads of their kings, and to present them to Lord Father. He was incapable of anything save destruction. He hears the voices of stars and dreams of splaying their glistening viscera before the temples of mankind. He sees the bones of gods and seeks to break them open, to suck out their marrow, to drink their souls and songs. This was good. He kept his purposes at highest priority in his mind as the next stanza began. Madonna pulled free from her sister's grasp, and with a grin and eyes shining brightly, she began a long and practiced boast. He endured it without complaint. "Who are you?" The vision of himself had asked. "Your sisters." The visions of the girls had answered. They were his sisters after all. Gore-born daughter. She was Madonna, foremost among all learners of Prospero. She was she who learned all they had to teach in a single year. She was she whose visions extend far beyond their farthest seers. She was she who descended from the heavens in a ball of fire and who grew at a pace unknown to any other. Beautiful pale red skin, luscious blood-red hair, gorgeous purple eyes. Who was fairest among all of Prospero? Nay, all of humanity. She was a vision of beauty and power, and all who looked upon her should fall to their knees in praise. She was a daughter of the Emperor of mankind, a figure who stood above even some buildings, clad in gold, light and fire, a sunfire soul that eclipsed even the tallest and greatest of towers. He was the supreme authority over a world, a system, a nation, an empire across the stars. He was the father of 20 individuals just like her, and creator of 100 more than were almost their equal in craftsmanship. Worshipped as god and master by a galaxy-spanning cult, with psychic power enough to turn storms of warp into tatters and gentle breezes, knowledge of technologies and histories now long lost to the rest of mankind, and wisdom beyond the ancients. Who else could possibly be her sire? There was no doubt about that. It had been almost 2 years since she'd been retrieved by her father. Departing from the learned scholars of Prospero with bright smiles and loud boasts, a small detachment from her father's fleet left behind to help integrate them into the wider Imperium. She ignored her nerves as that happened, keeping her indomitable mood up. Prospero was a miserable place, the people tormented by spiritual parasites and their fates as outcasts. Her arrival was a sign to them, a sign of changing fates. They were sometimes irritated by her loudness, her boisterous ways, but they were not thinking about their misery while they were focused on her shenanigans. That was more than reason enough to keep the grin on her face and confidence unshakable. It gave them hope, the best thing she could do for them at the present. She ignored the pangs of homesickness. She was Madonna, her arrogance absolute. There was nothing she could not do if she set her mind to it, no misfortune that could not be averted. So long as she believed in it, they would find themselves believing in her, and hope would spring anew. She wondered how Aemon was doing. She hoped he was doing well. Behold, mind place of study, mind chamber of knowledge, she declared, throwing open the doors to the chamber. She was not quite large enough to open the doors with physical strength alone, which was irrelevant, as she was a sorcerer of tremendous power. She used her psychic might to open the massive wrought adamantium doors, leading into the auditorium. Striding into the semicircle chamber, she turned to throw her arms wide, presenting the place for her brother. Like many of her siblings, he had shock-white hair that hung down to his hips. Lightly tanned skin covered in strange blue seams that accentuated muscle groups and joints. Currently, his modesty was covered by wings that extended from his upper back and down like a feathery skirt. His eyes roamed the room blankly, reminding her of Sister Danu's frigid expressions. She ignored that look in his eyes and focused on his overall frame. As expected of her father, he looked really magnificent. She could practically see him fighting a whole army on his own. He was a little slow and lazy, judging from his deliberate manner of speech and sleepy habits, but that was just fine. She'd help him learn to present himself appropriately. She was a generous master of sorcery. Madonna, we all learn here. Sister Fulgrim gently corrected, causing Madonna to click her tongue. That was a less impressive way to say that. Her sister needed to learn how to present these things appropriately. Please don't confuse our brother. He is not confused. Look upon his gaze. He understands all he perceives. She boasted on his behalf. Fulgrim raised a brow at her, then glanced over at Eye-Bring Light. He was currently staring at Danu, who was holding up a book in turn. A book of architectural notes. He evaluated it blankly, before nodding. Danu nodded in turn, and set the book down once more. Madonna pursed her lips. Somehow she could feel Fulgrim do the same. Brother was not what she had been expecting. Since saying their names, he had not spoken more than a handful of times. They had shown him most everything they typically do upon the ship thus far, all of it met with idle disinterest. Honestly, showing him this chamber had been something of a last resort. She was running out of ideas to engage him with. Throwing that concern aside, she marched forwards and threw her hands towards the projector. Behold, the device that presents the wisdom of our ancients to us. The hollow projector. She got into the groove of another practiced speech, ignoring the blank look in her brother's eyes. There was something wrong with him inside, an emptiness. It was not like the quiet contemplation of Sister Danu or the stoic presence of the custodians. It was something deeper. She didn't know what to do about it. The thought was frustrating to her. At least he wasn't deliberately irritating like Sister Loffen liked to be, daughter of Wildsea. It took her a while to realize that she was overthinking this whole civilization business. Despite all their fancy words and ceremonies, they were pretty much the exact same as the wilderness she grew up in, just bigger and much more crowded. King Thengir had taught her quite a bit. Most of it was useful, some of it was useless, and often it was explained in the most roundabout ways. What was honor? Thengir gave a great long-winded explanation every time she asked, and it was often pretty confusing. She eventually figured out that honor was just doing what was right and sticking to what you were going to do anyways. What were funerals? Thengir gave speeches on things that elaborated on themselves a few dozen times before, none of which helped until she actually saw a few funerals in practice. Small boats burning, ferrying the souls to the All-Father and away from the wolf ghosts. A funeral was a way to make sure the scavengers didn't get to the bodies or souls of the dead, because fuck those guys. She figured out the trick eventually. Figuring out civilization meant ignoring all the things people said and just focusing on what they do instead. That gave her answers that were way easier to understand. Everything else was just a heaping of gravy over the meat. A giant showed up at the gates, showed off lots of witchery, but sat down in the dirt to share some guest wine with Thengir. Instead of ensorceling the king, that is. Being all polite-like and waiting to enter until after being invited in. Good start. Giant says it's her dad. So she saunters down and takes a measure of him. So she calls him what he is, something she noticed the civilized folk don't take kindly to for whatever reason. Words have to be behind a sheet of ice misdirection for some reason. Instead of getting angry or getting called a big fucker, he laughs loud and hard. That was a good sign. So she goes along with this whole affair. Giant ships the tribe up to the land of the gods with his Starfleet, and she goes with him off the planet. She wasn't too bothered by this. The tribe was in a good place now, and she could always come back later to visit again. The Emperor of Mankind was a mouthful. She decided to call him Pops instead. She insisted on bringing her brother wolves with her, though. They had stuck with her this long, she wasn't about to leave them behind. Something he had agreed to, with a grin behind that glow on his face. Real hard to distinguish much behind that. Kinda pissed her off, if she was being honest. Turn the lights down, won't you? That's too bright. Her sisters were pretty fun, she supposed. Danu was a cute one. Fulgrim had a strong name. Madonna was fun to mess with. She kicked off the tree root, roaring in challenge while thrusting the spear forwards. The gorilla beast with red fur turned to roar back at her, and Hathor could throw a fucking punch. The turning of its face caused it to smash directly into the hammer-blow fist of her sister. A boom of flesh and bone smashing into flesh and bone sounded out. The blow knocked the beast off balance and staggering back, deeply wailing in fury and pain. This left it wide open. Kicking off the ground again, her spear made a wonderful sound as it impaled the beast right through its other heart, pinning it to the tree behind it. Her arms shook with the force of the blow, and she took a moment to exhale before pulling back. She turned to grin at Hathor. This hunting trip was exceptional thus far. She had to come back here at some point. Hathor grinned back, raising an arm and patting at her bare bicep, still flexed and tense with adrenaline. Planting a boot on the now limp gorilla, she grunted and strained. A sharp crack, and the wood of her spear splintered, then broke entirely in two. Falling back a few feet before steadying herself, Lofna raised the hunk of now useless wood in her hands and stared at it, then at the corpse of their kill. She grunted before tossing the thing aside. "Weak-ass wood. We're running out of spears," Aethor declared. "Do you think they'll give us more?" Lofn hummed in contemplation before turning to the few men in golden armor. Pops insisted they bring with them, for their protection, or something like that. "Hey, you fellas got weapons we can borrow?" I broke another spear. The two looked at each other for a moment, then at their own spear-like weapons, then at the broken shafts on the ground. One spoke up. "Can you swear to not break them?" The man asked, voice low and rumbling with amusement. She grunted. No, she probably couldn't. Wasn't her fault. These weapons were too weak. She stomped over to the big beast, probably bigger than anything except the biggest wolves of Fenris. Reaching down, she grunted and attempted to lift it off the ground. "Fuck," she grunted out. "Need a hand?" Hathor amusedly asked, walking over to the beast to help her. "Nope," Lofn replied, straining with the weight. It must have weighed more than a longship. "You keep those nails pretty. Let a big, strong shield maiden like me handle this." Hathor snorted, ignoring her and taking on half the load anyways. Lofn deliberately did not thank her for it, even if the eased burden was pretty nice. Together, they began to drag the kill out of the dense woodland, the custodians making sure nothing snuck up on them. Pops had come to them and asked if they wanted to help him hunt on Caliban. Apparently they had lots of big beasts that needed slaying, and the others were too young to be doing things like this. She had agreed at once, and Hathor was quick to follow. Sis was pretty stuck up at times, but boy did she know how to brawl. Her mace had broken already, shattered against a big six-legged, fire-breathing turtle-looking thing that was entirely too fast. That one was a pain to drag back. They needed the custodians to help out with it. Finally emerging from the tree line again, they pulled their newest kill over to the small army of butchers waiting to get at it. A massive line of warriors in steel plate and waving colorful banners were in front of them, moving aside to let the sisters pass. Behind them was tent after tent set up, military officers and tanners, and all manner of people who worked constantly to process the monsters they killed and brought back. There were songs in the distance, and lots of citizens cheering each time a custodian or group of Astartes dragged another kill out of the forest. This whole affair was planned to take place for a month, the warriors of her father moving to many places across the world and clearing out everything bigger than a bear. Slamming it against the ground with a great thud, the two sisters staggered over to the cute-looking serving boy with the wineskins and drank greedily from them. Handing them back with a sigh, they took a moment to refresh. She made sure to flex and smile for the native warriors. Boasting was a warrior's duty. A massive boom echoed out, and rows of trees shattered in the distance. They paused and turned their heads to look, as did many of the thousands of people present there with them. They watched blankly, waiting for new weapons to be handed to them as their father emerged from the tree line himself. Clad in shiny golden armor, with two building-sized white lions covered in spines and spikes, dragged along behind him. There was a great smile on his face as he hauled it over to the dumbfounded butcher army and dropped the corpses off, before galloping off into the dense woodland again, sword drawn and steps merry, the satchel on his waist bulging slightly. Trophies, no doubt. Lofn spat on the ground, pushing herself up and snatching a few spears from the rack, Hathor right behind her. They had only gotten 7 beasts of note so far, and the day was young. They weren't stopping until they matched father, or it went dark.